For the past 5 years, it's just been Ain and me. My wife's pregnancy with him wasn't easy. There were countless scares and close calls due to her lifelong health issues. Every doctor she had ever seen told her that pregnancy was out of the question. She always put on a brave face, joking that if she couldn't have children, she'd just adopt a whole litter of puppies. But when she thought no one was watching, her true feelings showed. She loved kids, and the idea of not being able to have one of her own was devastating for her. We talked about other options: adoption, fostering, you name it. We researched everything and even scheduled a meeting with an adoption agency. Then a miracle happened. Anne. Against all odds, Ellen became pregnant. Her doctors were baffled. It shouldn't have been possible. Yet, suddenly, we were planning a nursery in the second bedroom and rearranging our work schedules to ensure one of us would always be home with the baby. The challenges began about 4 months into her pregnancy. It felt like we were constantly in and out of the hospital for tests or procedures. Through it all, Ellen was incredible. While I was a nervous wreck, she remained calm, lying in the hospital bed, gently rubbing her growing belly and smiling. She'd reassure me, saying everything would turn out fine and that the complications were just minor setbacks. Her labor began early, just a few days after we reached the 31-week mark. One night, she calmly walked into the kitchen and announced that the baby was on the way. I was getting ready for bed, so while she grabbed the pre-packed hospital bag and car keys, I rushed around like a maniac, gathering the last-minute essentials. 6 hours later, N was born. He was so tiny that my heart sank as he came into the world. The doctor quickly whisked him away to a radiant warmer table where he and a nurse worked on him. Another nurse gently kept me at a distance so I wouldn't interfere. Then, all of a sudden, everything stopped, and the most beautiful sound filled the room. Our son's first cry. The doctor explained that N would need to spend a few weeks in the IU because of his size, but he was otherwise healthy. The relief hit me so hard that I had to steady myself by grabbing the bed's footboard. But then, the unthinkable happened. The alarm on Ellen's monitor went off. In less than an hour, N and I lost her. It wasn't the hospital staff's fault. There was nothing they could have done. The strain of labor and delivery caused massive hemorrhaging, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't save her. She never even got the chance to hold Anne. I didn't have time to grieve. Suddenly, I was a single parent, and my only focus was that tiny baby in the ICU. For weeks, my routine consisted of working my shift, then rushing to the hospital to spend the night with N before doing it all over again. Just before he was discharged, I managed to get a new job. It paid less but allowed me to work from home, something I desperately needed with no real family support system. I needed to be there for N at all times. After all, it was just the two of us now. I often find myself wishing Ellen could see the amazing child we created together. N is loving, energetic, frustrating, and endlessly surprising. He's everything we ever dreamed of and so much more. His vivid imagination, especially for his age, is part of what makes him so special. It's also why, at first, I didn't believe him when he told me he was being visited by something at night. It took time, but we eventually settled into a routine. Each evening, we have dinner together, then spend an hour playing outside if the weather allows or indoors if it doesn't. Anne gets his bath, and I tuck him into bed for the night. The routine is supposed to wrap up by 8:00 p.m., but as any parent knows, no routine is foolproof. The first night Anne mentioned a visitor, I hadn't managed to get him into bed until almost 9:00 p.m. I was catching up on work at my desk when I heard Anne call out for me. I hate to admit it, but my first reaction was irritation. Typically, when he called like that, it was for one last glass of water or to insist he wasn't tired. This happened at least twice a week. But when he shouted again, this time with panic in his voice, I felt my stomach drop. I pushed back my chair so hard it tipped over and bolted up the stairs to his room. Flinging the door open, I immediately switched on the light. Anne was sitting upright in his bed, tears streaming down his face. His pajama pant leg was pulled up, and his little hands were pressed tightly against his leg. The bed sheets and comforter were on the floor, and his pillow dangled halfway off the mattress. I rushed to his side, lowered the safety rail, and knelt by his bed. He threw his arms around my neck, sobbing so hard he began to cough. I gently pried him off me and held him in my lap to help him catch his breath. We stayed like that for a long while, him crying and sniffling as I stroked his hair and reassured him that everything was okay. When he finally calmed down, I sat him on the edge of the bed and carefully moved his hands from his leg. There were 3 long scratches running down it, not deep, but with small beads of blood. I softly asked him what had happened. At first, he said nothing, just staring at the floor. I asked again, and this time he looked me in the eyes and whispered, "Nettie, night hurt me." I blinked in confusion, not sure what I had expected him to say, but it certainly wasn't that. "Nutty night?" I asked gently, "like what I say to you before bed?" "Nighty night," N repeated, his voice firmer this time. He scratched me, like the bad cat did. The reference to the bad cat brought back a memory. Shortly after his 3rd birthday, N had been scratched by a neighbor's kitten when he tried to play with it. The kitten's claws had even punctured his skin. It wasn't serious, but it had left an impression on him. "I'm sorry, big guy," I murmured, pulling him close again. "For don't understand," I said. "Are you saying nighty-night is a cat?" "No, Daddy," N replied, his voice trembling. "Nighty-night is a monster. He hurt me." I looked back at the scratches on his leg. They were real, but there was no way they had been caused by a monster. Something else must have happened. Let me be clear, I never for a second believed N was lying. Like any child his age, he might tell little fibs now and then, but not about something this serious. Besides, the fear in his voice and the tears streaming down his face weren't something he could fake. Scooping him up in my arms, I carried him into the bathroom and grabbed the first aid kit from the cabinet. As I sat on the toilet with N in my lap, I realized I had forgotten to trim his nails during his baths the past few nights. I mentally kicked myself. He must have scratched himself in his sleep, and his half-asleep mind likely turned it into a nightmare about a monster. I quickly cleaned and bandaged the scratches before grabbing the nail clippers and trimming his tiny fingernails. By the time I was done, he had calmed down. I gave him a big hug and carried him back to his room. But when I tried to put him down in bed, he clung to me so tightly I almost lost my balance. He refused to sleep in his room that night. We ended up falling asleep on the couch downstairs. By morning, N seemed to have forgotten all about the previous night. It was Saturday, and since I didn't have to work on weekends, I decided to take him to the local state park. We spent the entire day playing on the playground and splashing in the lake. By the time we left, we were both exhausted. N fell asleep in his car seat just a few minutes from home. I carried him upstairs to his bed, and he stayed fast asleep through it all. I planned to let him nap for about an hour so he could still eat dinner and go to bed at a reasonable time. Finally, I kicked off my shoes and flopped into a chair, savoring the rare moment of silence. That peace didn't last long. The silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream from N's room. This wasn't the kind of cry I'd heard the night before. This was pure terror and pain. I yelled his name as I sprinted up the stairs and burst into his room. N was on the floor, his thumb in his mouth, rocking back and forth. His watery eyes stared blankly at me, as if he recognized I was there but didn't care. I picked him up, and as I did, I felt something warm and wet on my hand. I pulled my hand away to find blood. Panic surged through me as I carried him into the bathroom and turned on the light. In the mirror, I saw his back, and it felt like someone had poured ice into my veins. His shirt was in shreds, and the remaining pieces were soaked in blood. I set him on the counter and carefully lifted the torn shirt over his head. Anne didn't react, not even a flinch. I realized he might be in shock. On his back were 3 deep cuts, spaced in the same pattern as the scratches on his leg from the previous night. But these were far worse, bleeding freely and far beyond my ability to handle with a basic first aid kit. I bandaged him as best as I could before rushing him downstairs and into the car. The drive to the hospital was agonizing. I tried to keep pressure off his back by padding his car seat with a blanket, but N started screaming in pain before we'd made it very far. Desperate, I pulled over, unbuckled him from the car seat, and placed him sideways in the passenger seat so his back wouldn't touch anything. I knew it wasn't safe or legal, but I couldn't bear to see him in so much pain. When we arrived at the hospital, the nurse at the ER desk took one look at Anne's back and immediately waved us through. She ran off to get a doctor, leaving me standing there, holding my injured, unresponsive child, praying for help to come quickly. I gently set N down on a nearby gurney, careful not to put any pressure on his back. Hugging him as best as I could without touching his injuries, I whispered, "Everything's going to be okay, little man. I know it hurts, but I need to ask you something." I tried to give him a reassuring smile despite the knot in my stomach. "What happened?" Without hesitation, N replied in a matter-of-fact voice, "Nighty-night hurt me." I didn't get the chance to ask him more because the doctor arrived. She took one look at Anne's back and immediately instructed a nurse to wheel him into an examination room. I moved to follow, but the doctor stopped me. "I think it's best if you wait out here," she said, her tone firm. Her gaze, however, wasn't on me. It was focused on something, or someone, behind me. I turned to see a security guard standing at the end of the hallway watching us. The pieces should have clicked in that moment, but I was too worried about N to fully process what was happening. The doctor entered the examination room, and a nurse came back out, gently guiding me away from the door. I protested, of course, but she calmly explained that I needed to answer some questions before I could see N again. She started by asking if we had any pets or animals at home. I told her we didn't. Next, she asked if anyone else had been with us when Anne's injuries occurred. When I said no, she inquired if I had been drinking that day. That was when the reality of the situation hit me. They thought I had hurt my son. As the questions continued, a man in a grey suit approached us. He introduced himself as a social worker, explaining that his job was to ensure Anne's safety and well-being. He had his own set of questions, and I answered them honestly, but I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. My inability to explain what had happened certainly didn't help. Eventually, the doctor returned from the examination room. She informed me that one of Anne's cuts was shallow enough to bandage, but the other 2 required stitches. Hearing this, I was furious, not because of the treatment Anne had received, but because I had been kept out of the room the entire time. I wanted to be there for my son, to comfort him while he went through something so scary. I let my frustration out, yelling at the doctor for excluding me. She remained calm, letting me say my piece. Once I started to wind down, she explained that she was recommending Anne stay overnight at the hospital for observation. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I asked, "Will I be allowed to stay with him?" The doctor didn't respond. Instead, the social worker answered in a carefully measured tone. "Due to the nature of Anne's injuries," he said, "I'll be taking him into my custody for the night while I work to determine what happened." His words were polite, but the implication was clear. They thought I might have hurt Anne. "You think I hurt my son?" I asked, anger boiling just below the surface. "I would never hurt him. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you." "That's enough," the social worker interrupted, his voice sharp. "You need to stop right there. I haven't made any determinations yet about what happened. But I will say this, I've dealt with a lot of abusive fathers in my time, and you don't strike me as one of them." His words offered little comfort. Anne was still hurt, scared, and now being taken away from me. if only temporarily. All I could do was hope they would see the truth soon. I have policies and protocols I must follow, the social worker said. What's best for everyone involved is if you go home for the night, get some rest, and let me do my job so we can put this behind us. His words caught me off guard. I stared at him for a long moment before reluctantly nodding. Anything other than compliance could jeopardize my situation, and while the thought of being away from Anne for even one night made me feel physically ill, the idea of losing him permanently was far worse. I nodded again, and he gave my arm a reassuring pat. "Come back in the morning," he instructed. "Ask for me at the desk." He turned and walked toward the examination room. Just as he opened the door, I clearly heard Anne call out for me. It took everything I had not to push past him and go to my son, but I forced myself to leave the hospital. It felt like my entire world was crumbling around me. When I got home, I went straight to Anne's room. Determined to figure out what had happened, I began tearing the place apart. The scratches on his leg could possibly be explained as something he'd done to himself in his sleep. But the cuts on his back, there was no way he could have made those on his own. They were too deep, and he couldn't have reached that part of his body. Something else was going on. I searched every inch of his room. I checked for a loose screw or nail, a broken piece of his bed, or a toy with sharp edges. Anything that might explain his injuries. But I found nothing. Frustrated and defeated, I leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. As I sat there, something caught my eye. Reaching over, I picked up a small stuffed duck. Its yellow fabric had faded, and it looked worn from years of use, but I recognized it instantly. It was Quacker's, the first toy Ellen had ever bought for Aine. She'd picked it out shortly after we found out she was pregnant. The name, absurd as it was, had always made us laugh. The weight of the day finally caught up with me. My eyelids grew heavier with each heartbeat, and I started to nod off. A little sleep, I reasoned, would do me good. I needed to be at the hospital first thing in the morning. That was when I saw it. One moment, the corner of Anne's room was empty. The next, it was there. The creature was tall, impossibly tall. Its thin, grey body bent awkwardly to fit under the ceiling. Its elongated limbs ended in 3 needle-like fingers, each extending at least 3 feet. Its head sat atop a disturbingly long neck, its face twisted into an eternal grin. The cracked, dry lips stretched wide, revealing oversized, gleaming white teeth. Its eyes, black in the center with a sickly yellow surrounding them like aged parchment, were lidless and unblinking. Dark, viscous ichor dripped from its jaws onto the floor, pooling silently as it watched me. Nighty-night, the creature rasped, its voice low and guttural. I jolted awake, my entire body trembling. The creature was gone. There was no trace it had ever been there. The ichor on the floor had vanished. I sat on the floor alone, my pulse racing and my breaths shallow and uneven. I could have tried to rationalize what I had seen. It would have been easy enough to convince myself it was a trick of the light, or that my sleep-deprived mind had conjured a horrifying vision. That would have been the logical explanation. But the problem was, I had seen it. I knew it had been real. There was no doubt in my mind. It defied all logic, but I was certain that the creature had been standing in the corner of the room just moments earlier. As my breathing slowed and my initial panic subsided, it was replaced by a sickening realization Anne had seen it too. That nightmare of a creature had been in the room with my son, towering over him with that horrific face, and it had hurt him, twice. If I was this terrified, I couldn't imagine how scared Anne must have been. He'd called it Netty Night. That must have been what it said to him, the same words it rasped to me. I shakily got up from the floor and left Anne's room, closing the door behind me. Standing in the hallway, I felt my stomach churn violently. I rushed to the bathroom and threw up into the toilet. The nausea seemed endless. It felt like I would never stop. When it finally subsided, I slumped against the bathtub, my head spinning and my body weak, teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. Then I heard it, a dull thud from N's room. Lifting my head as best I could, I peered through the bathroom doorway. My blurry vision focused just in time to see the door knob to N's room slowly start to turn. With a soft click, the door creaked open. Filling the doorway was Nighty Night. Its grotesque face grinned down at me, wide and unrelenting. I tried to get up, but my body was too drained from throwing up. I could do nothing but watch in horror as the creature pressed its head against the wooden doorframe. At first, its oversized head was too large to fit through the opening, and I felt a fleeting sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Nighty Night began to push harder, and its head started to stretch unnaturally, as if its face were made of rubber being forced through a narrow gap. Nighty Night, it rasped, its voice distorted as it came through its warped lips. I needed to leave. Now, ignoring the pain and the dizziness threatening to overtake me, I forced myself to my feet. My legs wobbled, and I felt like I might collapse again, but I had no choice. I had to move. The creature's face was almost entirely through the doorway now, its grotesque grin mere inches from me. I pressed myself against the hallway wall and edged past it, feeling its hot, full breath on my skin. Its needle-like teeth were terrifyingly close, but I made it through the narrow space and stumbled down the stairs. On the last step, my foot caught, causing me to stumble forward. I tripped over the side of the couch and hit my head hard on the armrest. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was greeted by the worst headache I'd ever experienced. Groaning, I sat up on the couch, regretting the motion instantly as pain shot through my skull. Then I heard it, a steady, insistent knocking at the door. For a moment, I was too disoriented to understand what was happening. Slowly, I got to my feet and started toward the door. But then the events of the night came rushing back to me. My gaze shot up to the stairs, half expecting to see Nighty Night squeezing its way down toward me. The hallway was empty. The creature was gone. Still dazed, I approached the front door and opened it. Standing on the other side was a large man in a police uniform. He held a clipboard under one arm and a pen in his hand. He nodded at me but didn't smile. "Are you your name?" he asked. I nodded and confirmed my name. "I'm here at the request of the social worker from the hospital," he said. "I need to inspect your son's room." I stepped aside and let the officer into the house, closing the door behind him. Leading him up the stairs, I pushed down the growing unease inside me. After what I'd experienced, I didn't want to go anywhere near the second floor, but I knew refusing his request would hurt my chances of getting Anne back. When we reached Anne's open bedroom door, we stepped inside. Of course, Nighty Night wasn't there. The officer pulled out his clipboard and asked me a few questions, which I answered to the best of my ability. He scribbled notes as I spoke, nodding occasionally. After a moment, he knelt down to examine the safety rail on N's bed. "Have you done anything in this room since bringing your son to the hospital?" he asked. I glanced around the room, trying to figure out what he meant. I moved a few things around to look for answers. I replied honestly, but I didn't change the bed sheets or anything like that. The officer nodded. "Well, it looks like Miss Eaton was right." "Mr. Eaton?" I asked. "The social worker assigned to your son," he explained. "See here." He pointed to the safety rail. "There's no blood on the sheets, but there are 3 streaks along the rail. They match the spacing of the poles on the rail. Eaton thinks your son tried to climb out of bed while he was still groggy, slid over the rail, and caught the poles just right through the fabric. That's how he got those cuts." He stood up and gave a small smile. "Cute kid, by the way." He said something about going Nighty Night and his back hurting when he tried to get out of bed. Eaton pieced it together from there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The theory was completely wrong, and Anne's words had been entirely misinterpreted. The scratches on the safety rail were pure coincidence. But as wrong as it was, the explanation worked in my favor, and I wasn't about to argue. Good thing Eaton figured it out. The officer continued. If he hadn't, or if I'd found anything to contradict him, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Satisfied, the officer left the house and headed to his car. I watched him through the window as he drove away, relief washing over me. The sun was starting to rise, casting warm light over the trees, and I could hear robins chirping from the yard. It felt like a sign, a fresh start. Deciding it was close enough to morning, I left for the hospital to get Anne back. The process went smoother than I expected. The social worker had me fill out a few forms for the record, and then he led me to a patient room on the other side of the hospital. The moment he opened the door, Anne came running toward me barefoot and with his little hospital gown trailing behind him. He practically launched himself into my arms, hugging me tightly. Being careful to avoid the white bandages covering the cuts on his back, I hugged him just as tightly in return. We stood there for what felt like forever, me crying and Anne excitedly telling me all about his stay in the hospital. That was 2 months ago. The house where I raised Anne is now for sale. My realtor tells me there's already a lot of interest, even though it hasn't been on the market long, a seller's market, she calls it. I've only been back twice since that night, once to grab clothes and necessities, and once to pack the rest of our belongings and put them into storage. Both visits were during broad daylight, and each time I made sure to leave as quickly as possible. I made arrangements for N to stay with someone while I returned to the house. For the past 2 months, we've been living in a hotel on the other side of town. My long-term plan is to move far away, possibly all the way to the coast. I want to put as much distance as possible between us and this place. Last week, I came across a chilling article in the local newspaper. It was about a police officer who had killed his wife. According to the report, he claimed that he had just started dozing off one night when a giant monster appeared in his bedroom. Terrified, he grabbed his gun from the nightstand and fired 5 shots at it. The monster vanished, but tragically, his wife had been walking into the room at that moment, and 2 of the bullets struck her, killing her almost instantly. No one believed his story. How could they? It sounded absurd, like the ramblings of a man grasping at straws to escape responsibility. Still, he seemed so convinced that he was telling the truth that they ordered a psychological evaluation before filing formal charges. 3 days later, he was found dead in his jail cell. Not just dead, but nearly decapitated. The police were baffled. He'd been alone in his cell, and there was nothing inside that he could have used to harm himself in such a gruesome way. Some guards speculated that another prisoner might have gotten in and done it. After all, former cops don't have many allies in jail. But no one could explain how someone could enter his cell and cause that level of damage without being seen or heard. That officer was the same one who had come to my house. I know what happened to him. It was the same thing that almost happened to me and Anne. It was nighty night. I think I've started to piece together how the creature works, how it appears and disappears. Both times I saw it, I was on the verge of losing consciousness. The first time, I was falling asleep. The second time, I was trying not to pass out. When I blacked out completely, the creature didn't harm me. The officer's statement mentioned that he was dozing off when the monster appeared. I believe nighty night exists in that fleeting moment between wakefulness and sleep. It's in that brief, fragile space where you can see it, and it can see you. Or maybe it's always there, lurking, watching, waiting for that moment when our worlds overlap. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. I doubt I ever will. I could try asking Anne about his experience, but I refuse to do that. He's sleeping through the night now. His wounds are mostly healed, and I won't force him to relive those horrifying memories. He's been through enough already. My job is to protect him from anything that might hurt him, whether it's something natural or something unnatural. He deserves to feel safe. But I can't shake the fear that this isn't over. Last night, As Arne slept peacefully in the hotel bed, I sat in an uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room, watching over him. Exhaustion crept up on me and I started to drift off. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something. It was faint, barely audible, as though coming from far away, but I recognized it immediately. "Nettie Knight," rasped the voice outside the window. I jerked awake, heart pounding, and immediately stood to start packing our things. I was careful not to wake Ein. He needed his rest. We're going to be on the road for a long, long time.